Welcome to Shahnameh, Book of Kings. Today we begin the chapter called the Ashkanians. Who was it that said in the Book of the Righteous concerning ancient times? What does it say about the period after Sekandar had gone? Who occupied the throne then? A knowledgeable landowner from Chuch put it like this: no one occupied the ivory throne. The chieftains who claimed descent from Arash, who were a valiant, impulsive, and stubborn clan, were scattered about in different corners of the world, each of them cheerfully ruling a petty kingdom. Collectively, they were called kings of the peoples. And so 200 years went by, you'd say, that monarchy itself had passed away. The head chiefs were happy to ignore each other, and the earth was cleansed of war. Sekandar had foreseen and planned this peace to safeguard the prosperity of Greece. The first among the new kings was Ashk, of the family of Kobad. Others include Shapur, who was of equally noble birth, the Ashkanian prince Gudaz, and the Kyanid prince Bizan, Nursi, the mighty Hormazd, and Arash, who was a fearsome warrior. After him there was Ardavan, a wise and clear-sighted man. When the Ashkanian Bahram became king, he distributed wealth among the deserving, and was called Ardavan the Great because he was a man who protected his flock from the wolves' claws. He held the area from Shiraz to Esfahan, which discerning men have called the seat of nobility, and by his authority Aztekar was ruled by Babak, a man whose snares terrified dragons. But all these ruled for such short time and had no influence that the chronicler did not record their lives in detail. I've heard nothing but their names and seen nothing about them in royal records. All this was as the dying Sekandar had planned. Greece would remain safe and prosperous, while the eastern princes were preoccupied with local affairs and so paid no attention to her. When a wise man becomes king, his knowledge ensures that such plans come to fruition. When Dara was killed in battle and his family fell upon dark times, a wise, brave son, who was called Sasan, survived them. When he saw that his father had been murdered and that the Persians' fortunes were in ruins, he fled before the Greek army and escaped from the general disaster. He died obscurely in India, but left behind him a son who bore his name, which continued in the family for 4 generations. They lived as shepherds, sometimes as camel drivers, and all their years passed in poverty and hard labor. The last, while still a child, presented himself before Babak's chief shepherd and said, "Do you need a laborer, someone who can live out his wretched life here?" The shepherd hired Sasan, and who worked day and night and pleased his master, so that when he grew up, he became chief shepherd in his turn. He was a man who lived in sadness by the sweat of his brow. One night, as Babak slept, his bright soul dreamed that Sasan was riding a war elephant, and in his hand was an Indian sword. Everyone who came before him bowed down to him. He made the earth flourish and drove sorrow from the hearts of men. The next night, Babak dreamed that a fire worshipper lit 3 fires on the plain. They were just like the fires in the temples of Azar, Goshap, Korad, and Mer, and they shone like the turning heavens. All 3 burned before Sasan and fled with aloes wood. Babak woke in consternation from his dream and summoned Oneiromances. They gathered at his court, and when Babak told them what he'd seen, they grew pensive. Finally, the most senior among them said, "Great king, we must consider what this means. Anyone who is seen in this way by others in a dream is destined to raise his head above the sun in sovereignty, and if the dream does not refer to him, it will be fulfilled by his son." Babak was overjoyed when he heard this, and rewarded each of them presents according to his rank. Then he gave orders to his chief shepherd to appear before him. It was a bitterly cold day, and the man appeared dressed in coarse clothing, his sheepskin coat covered in snow, and his heart almost split in 2 with anxiety. Babak commanded that the court be cleared, and the servants and counselors left the 2 alone. He questioned Sasan and was cordial to him, sitting him beside him. He asked him about his family and his lineage, but the shepherd was terrified at first and made no answer. Finally, Sasan said, "Your Majesty, if you will take pity on your shepherd, swear with your hand in mine that no matter what lineage might be, you will not seek to harm me, either openly or in secret." Babak swore by merciful God that he would not harm him in any way. His intention was only to make him happy and treat him with respect. Then the young man said, "I am the son of Sasan, a descendant of King Ardeshir, who is remembered under the name Bahram, and who was the son of the great Esfandiar, the son of Goshtap." When he heard this, Babak wept that he had seen such dreams. He had splendid clothes and a royally accounted horse assigned to Sasan, and said to him, "Go to the hot baths, while they prepare your court clothes." He had a palace built for this man, who had once been his chief shepherd, and when he was installed there, Babak gave him slaves and attendants, and every kind of necessity for life. He gave him more wealth than he could need, and lastly, Babak gave him in marriage the crown of his life, his lovely daughter. When 9 months had gone by, this beautiful princess gave birth to a boy as splendid as the sun. He looked like Ardeshir, and he quickly grew into a brave, formidable child. His father called him Ardeshir, and his grandfather rejoiced to see him, and was always cradling him in his arms. So time passed, and perceptive men referred to the boy as Ardeshir, Babak. He was taught all the skills a prince should acquire, and they made his kingly nature even more splendid. His face and manner were such that you'd say the heavens themselves shone on borrowed light. News of the knowledge and courtly accomplishments of this young man, who said he to be a raging lion in battle, and as gracious as the goddess Nahid at banquets, came to Ardavan, who wrote a letter to Babak. He said, "Wise, prudent, eloquent, and renowned chieftain, I have heard that your grandson Ardeshir is a fine horseman, an eloquent boy, and quick steady. As soon as you read this letter, send him to me, and I shall treat him well. I'll give him all that he requires, and make the first of my warriors. When he is with my sons, I shall make no distinction between them." Babak wept when he read this letter, and he had Ardeshir and the scribe brought to him. He said to the young man, "Read Ardavan's message and pay close attention to it. I shall write an answer to the king now and send it with a trusted servant. I shall say, 'I send you this brave, fine young man who is my heart, the apple of my eye. I have advised him on how to act when he reaches your exalted court. Act towards him as befits a king, and do not let even the winds of heaven blow against him.'" Then Babak quickly opened his treasury doors and made the young man's heart happy with his gifts. He presented him with golden saddles, maces, and swords, gold coins, brocade horses, and slaves, Chinese cloths, and imperial textiles. He laid his wealth before him, holding nothing back from the boy, who was to serve Ardavan. He also sent gifts from Ardeshir for the king brocade and gold coins, musk, and ambergris. And so the promising young man left his grandfather and set off for Ardavan's court at Ray. Word was sent to the king as soon as Ardeshir arrived in the court, and Ardavan had him brought in. He talked with him for a while about Babak, seated him near the throne, and had quarters in the palace assigned to him. He also saw that food, clothes, and furnishings were provided for the young man. Ardeshir and his companions, who had made the journey with him, went to the lodgings they had been given. When the sun placed its throne in the heavens, and the world turned as pale as the Greek face, Ardeshir called one of his servants, and had him take him to King Ardavan the presents that Babak had sent. Ardavan was delighted by them, and the young man who had brought them seemed to him to be a fine addition to the court. He treated him as a child, and for a while saw that nothing disturbed the youth's happiness. Whether they were drinking wine, or at banquets, or out hunting, Ardavan kept him always nearby, and there was no difference between Ardeshir and Ardavan's own sons. And so it was that one day a group of courtiers and the king's 4 sons, all fine princes, had scattered across the plain in a hunting expedition. Ardeshir rode next to Ardavan, who was delighted to have the young man with him. Then, in the distance, a wild ass appeared, and cries went up from the hunters. Everyone gave chase, and the company was covered in dust and sweat. Ardeshir outstripped the rest, and as he neared the prey, he notched an arrow in his bow. When he loosed the shaft, it struck the animal in the flank, and the whole arrow, head, feathers, and all, passed right through its body. Just at that moment, King Ardavan rode up. He saw the arrow fly, and the wild ass lying dead, and exclaimed, "Bravo, whoever shot that arrow!" Ardeshir said, "I killed this wild ass with my arrow." But one of Ardavan's sons said, "I killed this beast, and I'd like to see anyone else manage such a feat." Ardeshir turned to him and said, "The plain is wide, and there are asses and arrows in abundance. Let's you bring down another one in exactly the same way. To a man with any pride, a lie is a sin." But Ardavan was enraged by his remark and shouted, "This is my fault, since it was me who brought you up. Why should I have put you at my banquets and take you hunting with me if you're going to push ahead of my sons and lord it over everyone? Go and look after my Arab horses and sleep in the stables with them. You can act the master there and be everyone's boy for every job that needs to be done." Ardeshir's eyes filled with tears, but he had no choice other than to go and live in the stables. He wrote a letter to his grandfather Babak, and as he did so his heart was filled with sorrow. His head was with wild schemes. He wrote of how Ardavan had acted toward him, and added that he hoped that the man would endure bodily pains and mental stress. He went over everything that happened, and where and why Ardavan had erupted in rage. When this message reached Babak, he kept its contents to himself. He was upset, and he sent the young man 10,000 dinars from his treasury. Then he called a scribe and dictated a letter to Ardeshir. "You're a callow young man, and you haven't much wisdom as yet. When you went hunting with Ardavan, what business had you attacking his son like that? You're a servant there, not one of the family. You are your own worst enemy, and you've grown and started acting foolishly. Now you must try to please him and keep him satisfied with you. Don't deviate from his orders even for a moment. I've sent you some money, and here I'm sending you some advice. When you use the one, remember the other until this business is over." An old, experienced messenger quickly brought the letter to Ardeshir, who was pleased when he read it. His heart began to weave plots and plans. He chose a house near the stables and filled it with carpets, fine clothes, and good food, so that it was hardly suitable for the work he was supposed to be doing. He spent his days and nights eating and drinking wine, and entertainers were his companions. King Ardavan possessed a slave whose face lit up his palace with bewitching grace. She seemed a painting, lovely and bejeweled. Her name was Golnar, and the slave girl ruled the palace as her monarch counselor, his first adviser, and his treasurer. He loved her more than life itself. The sight of Golnar filled the king's heart with delight. One day Golnar went up unto the palace roof and glimpsed the merrymaking in Ardeshir's courtyard. She was charmed by it, but when she saw Ardeshir's smiling face, the young man slipped into her heart. That night, toward dawn, she knotted a rope and let it down from the battlements. Boldly invoking God's benevolence as she did, so she made her way to the ground. Wearing her jewels and scented with musk, she appeared before Ardeshir. He raised his head from his brocade pillow, emerging from sleep, and took her in his arms. The young man stared at the beautiful girl before him, at her hair, her face, and splendor, and said, "Where have you come from, to delight my sorrow-sickened heart in this way?" She answered, "I am a slave, and I live to see you alone in all the world. I am King Ardavan's treasurer, and the chief pleasure and solace of his soul. But if you accept me, I shall be your slave, and fill my heart and soul with adoration for you. I shall come to you whenever you wish, and change the darkness of your days to splendor." A little later, Babak, who had brought up Ardeshir, died, and left his place in the world to others. When news of this reached Ardeshir, his heart and soul were darkened, and he grieved for his protector. All the nobles vied to be appointed governor of Pars, but the king entrusted the post to his eldest son. He gave orders that the drums were to be sounded, and the army set off across the plain. Ardeshir's heart was dark with grief for the benevolent old man who had guided and cherished him, and took no pleasure in Ardavan's rule or his army. The news made him look for another course. His heart was filled with resentment, and he looked for some means of escape. At that time, King Ardavan, seeking to know who would be favored by the heavens, summoned astrologers to his courts. He sent them up to Golnar's quarters, whence they could observe the stars. For 3 days they worked there, casting the king's horoscope. The treasurer overheard their conversation about the stars, and for 3 days and nights, through the 3rd watch of each night, she eavesdropped on them, her heart filled with hope, her lips with sighs. On the 4th day, the sages took their astrological tables from Golnar's quarters to the king, and put them before him, and showed them what they had discovered. They told him in detail how the secrets of high heavens affected him, and said that in the near future something would happen that would bring anguish to the king's heart. A servant who was valiant and of noble birth would flee from his court, and the man would become a great king, a ruler of the world, powerful and blessed by the stars. Ardavan's heart was deeply troubled by these words. The land turned pitch black, and the slave girl made her way to Ardeshir. He was a sea of anger and resentment, unable to have a single day's peace because of the preoccupations with Ardavan. Golnar told him what the astrologers had told the king, and when he heard this, he calmed down, and he was silent for a while. Her words concentrated his mind, and he decided on flight. He said to her, "If I'm to get to Pars, if I'm to see that land again where men are brave and free, I must know if you'll come with me or stay behind with King Ardavan and Ray. If you accompany me, you'll be the crown of Persia, which will fill with your renown." And she replied between expressive sighs, with flowing tears from those lovely eyes, "I am your slave. I have one life to give, and it is yours entirely while I live." Ardeshir said to the beautiful girl, "We have no choice but to do this tomorrow." She returned to her own quarters, determined to take her life in her hands and risk everything. When dark nights withdrew and the world turned gold and the rising sun, Golnar opened the treasury doors and began to choose among the jewels there. She selected rubies and other royal gems, as well as a sufficient number of gold coins for their purposes, then returned to her room. There she waited till night came up over the mountains, and Ardavan's sleeping palace was deserted. Quick as an arrow then, clutching the jewels and cash she had taken, she came to the valiant Ardeshir. She stood with a wine goblet in his hand, and stable guards asleep at his feet. He had made them drunk, so that they would not impede the escape, and he picked out and saddled 2 fine horses. When he saw Golnar's face and jewels and red gold she'd brought, he immediately set down the goblet and put the bridles over the horses' heads. Armored and with a glittering sword in his hand, he mounted one horse and helped Golnar onto the other, and together they fled from the palace buildings and took the road to Pars, their hearts filled with joy and ambition. It was Ardavan's habit never to rise from his brocade bed until he had first seen Golnar's face as a good omen for the day. But when the time came to get up and to have his throne spread and brocade, and the slave girl still had not come to his pillow, he exploded with fury against her. The guard stood before his door. His throne, crown, and audience hall were ready for him, and his chamberlain came in, saying, "Your warriors and the country's nobility are waiting at the door." The king said to his servant, "See what is the matter with Golnar. It never happens that she doesn't come to my pillow. She knows what my habits are." At that moment, the chief scribe came in and said, "Sometime last night, Ardeshir fled. He's taken from the stable a black horse and a gray, both of them mounts favored by the king. And at the same time, the king lost his beloved companion, since it's clear that your treasure has fled with Ardeshir." Ardavan's warlike heart was enraged, and he set off with a large group of horsemen in pursuit of the fugitives. You'd have said that their horses trod on fire, so swiftly did they gallop. At the roadside they saw a well-populated settlement with a number of animals, and asked if before sunrise anyone had heard the sound of galloping. A man volunteered that 2 figures on horses, one gray and one black, had galloped across the plain, closely followed by a pristine mountain sheep, which kicked up as much dust as the horses did. Ardavan asked his advisers why a mountain sheep should be running behind them, and the man replied, "That is his far," an earnest of his good fortune and sovereignty. "If this sheep sticks with him, do not struggle against the fact, or this will turn into a lengthy business for us." Ardavan dismounted at the settlement, ate and rested for a while, and then renewed the chase. With Ardavan and his advisers leading him, the group pressed on in pursuit of Ardeshir. Meanwhile, the young man and the slave girl rode like the wind without resting for a moment. Whoever is favored by the high heavens cannot be harmed by enemies. When they were tired out by their efforts, Ardeshir caught sight of a lake beneath them as they crested a hill, and he turned to Golnar and said, "Now that we are both exhausted by the journey, we should ride down to that water. Both we and our horses are worn and weak. We can stay by the water and eat something and ride on when we're rested." But as they approached the lake, with their faces as yellow and sickly as the sun, Ardeshir saw 2 young men standing there who shouted to him, "Stay in your stirrups now. Shake out your reins. Continue on your ride across the plains. You have escaped the dragon's deadly breath, but if you drink here, you'll encounter death." Ardeshir said to Golnar, "Remember their words." Their stirrups became heavy and their reins light. Ardeshir lifted his glittering lance to his shoulder, and they rode on. Tired and with darkness in his soul, Ardavan still rode after them like the wind, until at midday, when the sun had traversed half the sky, he saw a fine town. A number of its inhabitants came out to meet him, and he called out to the priests, "When did you see a young man ride by this way?" One of them answered, "Your Majesty, benevolent and blessed by heaven, at the time when the sun sets and night spreads its dark veil over the land, 2 people rode through this town. They were covered in dust, and their lips were dry with thirst. A mountain sheep followed one of them, and she was more splendid than any, and I've seen in a painting on a palace wall." Ardavan's advisers said to him, "The situation has changed. You should turn back here, muster an army, and prepare for war. His good fortune follows him, and our chasing after him like this is mere clutching at the wind. Write a letter to your son telling him of the whole business. Perhaps he can find some trace of Ardeshir. He must not be allowed to drink this sheep's milk." When Ardavan heard his words, he knew that his days were numbered, and that his glory was fading. He dismounted at the town and prayed to God, from whom all blessings come. At dawn the following morning he gave orders for the return journey. He entered Ray at nightfall, his cheeks as pale as reeds. There he wrote a letter to his son, and saying, "In our orchard a twisted root has been born. Ardeshir has fled from my hearth quicker than any arrow. He has gone to Pars. Find him, but do it discreetly, and tell no one in the world of this." And here is where I end my tale for today. But I'll be back tomorrow with more tales, many more tales. Until then, my friends,